Hey guys, Jeff here from WeBird Botanical, and this morning I'm going to be setting up a new vegetable planter. So I thought this was a perfect opportunity for me to talk a little bit about how you can grow your own produce in just about any space. So your number one consideration when starting out in your garden is where are you growing and what can you grow in. So some people have a bit patch of ground they can grow in, or they have established raised beds or something like that they can grow in. Other people like me have to rely on growing exclusively in containers in a small space. So I'm going to focus on containers because I think if you've already got ground or beds, then there's less to consider in this particular realm, because you've probably got a designated amount of space that you can grow in and you can just do that. Containers can be a little bit more variable because you can do all sorts of things like growing vertically and all that sort of thing. But I'm just going to talk about basic container choice. So I'm going to go through a few of the probably more popular container types and talk a little bit about the pros and cons for each. So we'll start with these just simple black plastic grow pots. These are the most budget friendly option you've got. They're also, besides being budget friendly, they're a good starting point if you've only got a little bit of room. You've got a range of different sizes. There's lots of different things you can choose to do in them. So this particular pot is a 140mm pot, and this one here is probably the smallest I'd go if you're growing produce. This is good for growing things like some smaller herbs and things in, like maybe some basil or chives or something like that. They'll do pretty well in these. You will have to keep up the water because they are a small pot. They're going to dry out faster. But if you've only got a small space and that's what you want to do is grow some herbs, then these are a good option. They go in a range of sizes as well, so that's probably, like I said, that's probably the smallest I'd go to, but you can get things like as big as this, which is, I don't know the dimensions off the top of my head, that's quite a large pot, and that'd be great for doing like a tomato and then maybe some herbs or lettuces in the bottom interplanted. You could grow quite a lot of produce in just that single pot. Probably your next step in terms of price, but it's still on the inexpensive side, but you get a little bit more decorative appeal out of them, is something like your terracotta pots. This pot is similar size to the black plastic one I had before. Again, this is probably the smallest I go for growing produce. You can do some pretty good herbs in these. I've grown herbs in these before. This size, I think this is a 13cm pot, so it's roughly the same size. Like I said, you can get some pretty good produce out of them. One of the downsides to terracotta, besides obviously being breakable if you drop them, is terracotta pots are porous, so they do dry out quite fast, especially at this size. But and same with these black plastic pots, you can mitigate that a little bit by using the addition of a saucer or something underneath. Especially on those really hot days, you can water in the morning, and then the pot's got a reservoir of water throughout the day if you're not going to be home to be able to check if it needs more water or anything like that. The next, I guess, sort of tier from that would be to go into grow bags, and these vary quite a bit in price. You can get them relatively inexpensively, but I'd say they're probably your mid to high tier in terms of price point. You can get other sorts of plastic pots that are a bit more decorative. Again, I've got this one here, which is a bit nicer than just your straight plastic. That particular pot only cost me about $5 or $6 or something like that. So again, that wasn't very expensive. And that's a good size. I've got a tomato and a basil in there, and that's a good size for that. Back to the grow bags though, the benefit to growing grow bags, besides they do have a bit more visual appeal, I feel, than just your standard plastic pots. I quite like the look of them, but I mean that's sort of a person-to-person thing, is they promote really good healthy root growth. So they use air pruning, so you can grow longer term things in there, like perennial plants, perennial fruiting plants, for example, and as the roots go outside the pot, they grow through the sides of the pot and then they get air pruned, and it just promotes really healthy root growth. Again, downside is they dry out quite fast because of that, so you've got to be on top of your watering with them, but I've had really good results out of my grow bags so far. So now I've talked a little bit about the different container types you can use, and again I've only briefly touched on them. They go quite wide and varied. You can just get people growing old bathtubs, people growing big flexi tubs that they drill some holes in the bottom of. I've just gone with some more traditional style of growing containers, which is stuff that you can buy readily at most stores. So now we go on to the second consideration, and that's plant choice, and that's really going to depend mostly upon what you want to grow in terms of what you want to eat, and your space will dictate it a little bit. So if you have a really tiny space, and I mean like really tiny, like maybe a meter by 50 centimeters, like a table or something like that on a balcony, then you might want to look at just growing some herbs or some leafy greens, because you can probably get quite a lot out of that space by growing things like that. If you've got a little bit more space, then you can start looking at growing things like tomatoes and other larger plants, dwarf fruit trees, things like that. Again, that's just going to be dictated by your space. My number one thing, I guess, piece of advice for that is grow what you know you're going to eat, and grow things that you would buy all the time. So if you buy lots of basil, it's probably a good idea to grow a basil plant or 2 basil plants, because then you can just harvest your basil there and you reduce what you're buying at the grocery store. So you're getting a sort of 2 for 1. Or grow things that you can't really get at the grocery store. If you don't have a wide selection at your local store and there's some things you want, then try growing them, because then you can get some different herbs or even leafy greens or root vegetables or whatever that you wouldn't normally be able to get. So that's sort of the considerations I'd have there. So now I want to talk a bit about setting up the container. Now I use the same method, whether it be a little plastic pot, a grow bag, terracotta pot, whatever it is, whatever container I'm growing in, I use the same method, and it's just pretty much a 50-50 mix of compost and potting mix. The reason I don't use just straight composting containers is twofold. A lot of the time if you're buying bag compost, it's still getting quite warm, so it's occasionally it's getting too hot to really grow in, but it usually settles down after a week or two. But it's just, you'd have to sort of let it have that settling period. And the other thing is, a lot of the compost, just straight compost in a container, isn't going to have the drainage you need. So adding a drainage element, you could just use straight compost with other drainage elements if you want, like perlite and things like that. But I prefer just to mix in some regular potting mix, because it's usually good for that, adding that drainage element, and it's just more organic matter really to compost down over time inside your container. I'll talk a little bit about potting mix selection before I get into it, and there's just a few things to consider. The number one thing to consider is whether you want to go organic or if you're not worried about being organic. I personally, especially for my food, prefer organic. I have used the potting mixes that have the synthetic slow release fertilizers in them, but even for my ornamentals, I'm starting to steer away from that and go just to organic base and then adding my own organic fertilizer to it. And the other thing is obviously going to be how much budget you have and how many containers you need to fill. So, if you need to fill a huge amount of containers, then it's probably either better to get a few and start with just a few with a better quality potting mix, or if you really want to get started, then obviously it's going to affect how much you can get. So me, I like to go the organic route, like I said, so I'm actually using probably like a mid-range price point potting mix. You can certainly do what I'm doing for a little bit cheaper, although the potting mixes that are typically available in Australia that are cheaper than the one I'm using, I find it tend to be a lot more full of like filler, so like bark and wood chips and things like that sort of, they're okay and they're fine to have in there, but they tend to be a little bit like too much of that for my liking. I prefer my potting mixes a little bit more refined, a little bit finer. So I'm going for about a mid-tier one, and I've used this before and with good success in ornamentals, but I've never grown food with it, so I'm going to try it. Because it's an organic base, it has no additives to it, no fertilizers or wetting agents or anything like that. And then I'm mixing in some just organic compost with it. So I'm using a mushroom compost. Again, this is a new compost for me. I wanted to try mushroom compost because I've used homemade compost, which has mushrooms in it, I guess, but it's homemade compost, and I've used just your regular compost. So all I'm going to do to start is empty a little bit of potting mix and a little bit of compost into the bottom, mix it around a little bit, just with a little hand fork. You can just use your hands, but I find this just does a bit of a better job. And then I'll just slowly add each one a bit at a time, mix them together until I get up to the top. And there you go, that's pretty much the process. You can see this is a 60 litre container, but 50 litres of mixed in it, and that's because it's kind of light and fluffy at the moment, fresh out of the bag. It will settle, so I will have to add a little bit more potting mix. I'll probably just leave it with my first lot of plants and then add some once I do harvest out. I'll probably just add some more mix and replant into it. So I thought I'd briefly touch on some plant selection stuff. I know I did a little bit before, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about, so obviously grow what you're going to eat, or grow what you can't really get your hands on that you want to eat. There's no point in growing something if you don't like it. That's pretty self-explanatory. But also choosing plant choice based on container. So I showed this tomato before. What up again? It's, like I said, I don't know how I said it, but it's a bit stunted because it got damaged by birds early on in its life. So it's actually growing a bit funny, but it is still producing fruit, and I left it in there because I thought, well, we'll see how it goes. And it does really well in that pot. Move the camera around to there, you can see I've got another tomato plant here, which is growing in one of the containers I just set up. And so one of the issues I found with these containers is growing things like tomatoes, because they need plant support. The plant support isn't so good in these. When you're in a more traditional pot, you put your stakes down close to the edge of the pot, and the pot actually helps with the support. Whereas in these containers, because of the way they are, it didn't work as well. I mean, that was an extreme wind that snapped that tomato and really blew it out, wrecked it. In normal weather conditions, it's fine, but yeah, we did have a pretty crazy wind. But still, my takeaway from that is that I think I should grow lower growing plants in these things. I think they're exceptionally good for leafy greens because they have that like water retention, and I think they're good for herbs as well, because herbs typically like quite a bit of water, and they're shallow rooted. So you sort of choose not only what you're going to eat, but what's going to suit your container. There's no point in trying to grow a big tomato plant in something this small. Again, it's pretty self-explanatory, but you know, you're not going to try and do that. You might grow it on in that for a bit and then pot it into something bigger. But a bigger container is better for things like that. You might be able to do something like a squash in here, because they're going to just fall over the edge. I've got squash in a grow bag at the moment, and that's what it's doing. It's just falling over the edge. And it's not really going to matter, or it might even spread on a whole lot, but I'd probably try and encourage it to go over the edge so you can grow some other stuff in the rest of it. So that's all for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you did, let me know down in the comments, or like the video, share it with people. All that's very appreciated. As always, thanks all for watching. I'll see you in my next one. Bye for now.